Man, it ain't complicated, you know, man. It's like a damn Rubik's Cube, man. You like talking about blue, red, man, then you get to one side and like messed up.
All right, Luthemplaer, welcome back to the show. How you doing, man?
All right, it's been a good Memorial Day.
Well, good. Glad to hear it. No technical difficulties ever on the Jay Burden show, so I figure we can just start from the top. So as I briefly said before, you mentioned that you wanted to talk to me about American architecture. I will say before we get into it, while this will go up as an audio version as well, there's a presentation that goes along with it. I will try and describe what we're looking at, but obviously there's a visual component to it. So if you have the chance, I'd recommend watching this one on YouTube or Odyssey, wherever you watch video stuff. But anyway, man, back to you.
Yeah, so this conversation comes from a few chats I've had with some of our mutual friends, such as Christopher Sandbach and Ryan Turnipseed, and the question really came up about where the American house comes from. Turnip was kind of drawing his own house and a house he wants, and he was kind of curious, like, why don't older houses have things like hallways or these kind of like cornered off spaces where kids played things far away from the parents? And Sandbach kind of knows this stuff too, and other people, but like essentially the original colonists to this land, they come from a Northern European background, and that idea of existence, it really oriented in a circular orbit around the house. So there weren't many if any hallways. The rooms were all kind of bunched up together, and this partially has to do with wanting to keep heat in the colder European climate, but it also has to do with just keeping the family together around that heat source. The heat source being the hearth. I've sometimes called Northern Europeans as like a hearthian culture, and Southern Europeans more of a like a strongman culture, where it was like very outdoorsy. When you put in your mind the idea of like a medieval lifestyle, you sometimes imagine like a bunch of serfs gathered around a fire. When you think about the Roman culture, you think of like legions marching in a linear fashion. Even though these are from the same area, your mind has invented these images that seem different, even though like there's vast overlaps between these two cultures. So essentially, what I wanted to say is like how did what we have today come from those first colonial forms? If you open up that presentation, the first image kind of like uses that. Oh, that's not. Yeah, sorry, we'll go with the whole presentation. So this is like from Seeds of Albion, which is like a pretty good book trying to identify the root cultures of the 13 colonies and what regions of England they came from. I don't know if you can zoom in on that little like housing presentation down there, but essentially, even at the architectural level, the regions of the United States borrow a lot of heritage from where they came from in England, and this also remains true for other areas, including French colonists, Swedish colonists, Spanish colonists, and even the Africans brought over a lot of their architectural like hut styles into the rural, which ironically blended rather well with the old Anglo-Saxon thatch style. And so what you see here is essentially like there's a certain kind of uniqueness to every region. Virginia seems to like more linear and orthogonal buildings that are like repetitious, kind of like almost like a Greek style, whereas Appalachia tends to have these like kind of spiraling moments within like a town. The homes can sometimes be bunched just up together rather unorganizedly, but like still have like a kind of a logic to it, and that also comes from where they were coming from in England. And even like the use of stone versus wood, there's a lot of borrowing from Britain. America wasn't colonized just by the British, and it wasn't first colonized by the British. The Vikings came there 1,000 years ago, and the Irish might have been there before that. And there was always a gradual migration from Siberia and other areas as different waves of cultures came. And as those cultures came over each other, they interacted and brought from where they came from, how they lived. One of the big reasons why the Vikings couldn't really grasp the New World is that the way in which they built homes with the longhouse, it kind of depended on a certain way of living that didn't really operate well in the northern Canada area. It did operate well in like areas like New England, where the Haudenosaunee tribe lived, also in longhouses, but the Vikings were more north than that, and so they couldn't really do very well, and ultimately abandoned their colonies after 200 years of attempted colonization. And the Irish, who might have come here before that, essentially just never did more than go fishing. They couldn't really maintain life on a different climate. It was really only later on, when the layers of culture in Great Britain came from the Romans, from the Greeks, from the French, and from the native Gauls, the Celts, when that synthesis of those different approaches to architecture came, and there was a kind of a vernacular uh, vocabulary of architecture that the colonists could actually pick and choose and adapt to the new climate, and actually live here. Um, if you go to the next slide. So this is kind of like a look at what the early Anglo-Saxons lived like in England. You'll note that there is kind of like a hallway in this plan. It's the main road leading up to the longhouse, and there's that paladide wall that divides between like the government and the people. So there's this separation, and the wall pierces it. The people live in these little thatch houses along the main road, and the road goes to the governing authority. But otherwise, you might notice that none of these homes really seem long enough to have a hallway. They all kind of seem centered around a hearth, centered around a family life that orbits throughout the building. And then, while the family orbits around the hearth of the building, the community orbits around this like central gathering hall regularly to discuss things. And those circular motions essentially define how the Anglo-Saxons, and also to some extent the Celts before them, inhabited their world. The motions around these heat sources of authority and warmth.
Well, it's
Uh,
interesting because,
go-
and just to describe this image, right? Like you've said, we see a long house at the top, a wall around it, and then some sort of smaller homes around the outside. And at the center of each of these, right, we see smoke rising up from kind of a central hearth. So there's sort of this idea of, it seems like concentric circles, right? The home built around the hearth, the homes built around the longhouse, and that, kind of like central seat of government at the center of it. Is that correct?
yeah, and that circular idea, even though the building's like rectilinear and square, the motions of the people are circles within circles. And this has some degree to do with just practicality. Like the buildings are smaller to keep more heat in, and the people gather close together to like share their heat. But even as the mini ice ages of the Middle Ages kind of ended, and it warmed up, they kind of maintained this style of living. Yeah, and so this is kind of exploring that the design of those homes in terms of how they really built around there. This feature of having many little islands under the bigger longhouse structure, and then the spiraling lifestyles within the home, within the community, really shows up. That photo up there, the diagram showing the hearth in the center, and the different communal living areas, even outside the house where the animals were, and where you cut wood, and where you clean things, they orbit around the hearth. So it's almost like these little mini solar systems that reinforce to the culture that they're a family, that they're a unit, that they care for each other, and resources circulate within the house, and then between homes, and then to the longhouse, the lord that rules over them. There was this like circular motion. I've sometimes said that one of the defining features of difference between Anglo-Saxons and Mediterraneans is the idea that in Anglo-Saxons, uh, in Anglo-Saxon or northern European cultures, there's the idea that the one who has the most responsibility is who you should follow, whereas in Mediterranean cultures, it's more the one who does the most things, like by their strength of will, is who you should follow. And while those sound similar, they're not actually similar, because you can have a king who does very little but holds on and maintains his responsibilities, and he's considered a lord among the Northern Europeans. Whereas amongst the Mediterraneans, if you had a king that did nothing, even if he was good at his responsibilities, he'd be viewed as someone to replace or compete with, because he doesn't do great deeds. And there may be like a sense that, well, wait, what, can our cultures do great deeds? Like the Northern Europeans might think, well, are you saying we can't do good deeds? But that's not what I'm saying. The great and good deeds are in taking on responsibilities rather than conquering a city and burning it to the ground like the Romans did. And this idea that responsibility is leadership in Northern Europe really shows up in the buildings in terms of the father leading this orbit of his house and the king or lord leading the orbit of his community, so on and so forth. And these orbits that kind of bound responsibility in these chains of like love, basically. This is a very Northern European idea. The Mediterranean had the idea of the pater familias, so the father had a responsibility to the household, but it kind of was more focused on the household rather than on the community or the lord in Northern Europe. This idea of the individual upholding his household almost like with the support of his ancestors and his gods, it tends to create like kind of like macho men that fight each other, and that's why you get a lot of civil wars in the Mediterranean. But yeah, you really see it in how in the Northern Europeans, this idea of responsibility shows up in terms of how the buildings are built and how the communities are built. This orbiting motion of responsibility is being shared or centralized often. So going to early colonial architecture, here is one of the earliest buildings in Pennsylvania from I think the 1600s. I forget, it might be written on there. But again, you notice even like centuries after the Anglo-Saxon came to England and like the Normans conquered them, like this is like um, basically like 1,000 years later. The home still lacks those hallways you sometimes see in more continental European houses. The home is still oriented around this central hearth, and the spaces on those plans you might see they orbit around this central heating source or hall where you enter into. I don't know if you have any thoughts about this, but you can kind of see like the way the spaces orbit around this core.
Well, it's obviously a more advanced evolution of the same idea, right? Where the hearth is, kind of the central feature of the home. Again, obviously, it's more than it's a two-story home, right? We have a number of different rooms, but it is sort of the same idea. It's basically a squared circle, essentially, at its most basic.
Yeah, you'll see some innovations, like because it's using brick and mortar rather than thatch, the fireplaces have moved to the supporting walls, but the spaces still orbit around each of them. Like now the hearth is more like the guardians of that central hall, but it's not really like a hallway. It's just like a little square space you enter to. The spaces still orbit around this like dance that you take on. Like every room is dedicated to your responsibilities rather than your enjoyments. And this is another important distinction between Mediterranean and Northern European homes. In Northern Europe, the spaces oftentimes are dedicated to your responsibilities, like your study room, your living room, your dining room. Whereas in the Mediterranean, it's more focused on your passions, like the great dining halls and the great like atriums and spaces where you share and have fun. It's a difference between focusing on responsibilities versus where you can do like mighty deeds, basically. And that difference really does inform how the family forms. If your home is oriented around places where you do great deeds and like kind of macho up, you're gonna have a very your sons will be warriors that fight with each other. And this is like a very Italian thing, you probably know. Whereas in Northern European, where it's more around what your responsibilities are, then the children will find a room that they like and kind of like specialize in that responsibility. Like the child that stays in the library becomes like very scientific. The child that stays in the work area becomes like a tradesman. And this is much more oriented towards I guess you could say generational stability versus the Mediterranean, where it's a little bit less stable. It has a lot more highs and lows that are more extreme compared to England, where there's longer continuities of civilization. Like in Rome, never really went through a dynasty longer than a few maybe like 5 or 6 generations before a new dynasty took over, or like a civil war happened, or a collapse happened, or an invasion happened. Whereas in Northern Europeans, you get these like century-long dynasties that last and build up. And in local communities, you have these trades that can go back like 1,000 years in terms of how long they've been maintaining the trade. And that difference really like shows up in the architecture in terms of how the building is formulated, either as a like highly vertical place to focus on your passions, or kind of lowly, even with 2 floors, it's still kind of short. It's more focused on looking horizontally and focusing on your responsibilities. And so even here, this is kind of moving more towards 1700s, maybe into the 1800s. And what we see here is that as the neoclassical starts to enter the United States, Thomas Jefferson and other architects, they really had a love of the Mediterranean architectural style. So they start bringing in a large amount of Mediterranean details. And so here you kind of see in the center there the first versions of an American hallway. It's a very primitive hallway, but the spaces are no longer centralized around a core like atrium. They're starting to divide out and spread out. They're starting to become more focused on where you can be great rather than where you can share responsibilities. It's still like it's kind of like a hybrid between the Greek and the Anglo-Saxon. Like the outside clearly looks Greek, and the inside looks a little bit like it's getting distant from that Anglo-Saxon tradition. But
Well, and that's
the,
an interesting point as well, right? Because so many of the founders were kind of steeped in the European tradition, right? And if you look at traditional American government architecture, right, there's a huge amount of neoclassicism to it, very clearly pulling from Greek and Roman sources, who obviously were Meds.
Yeah, and so on the top of this drawing, that's like more of a traditional American house, and this Greek style architecture is something else. They're not the same building. I just wanted to point out that like um that dialectic of how you live your life on the top drawing, it's still easy to get from one room to the other side of the house without crossing too many rooms. Whereas the building on the south, you have to go through like 5 or 6 different spaces to get to the other side of the building. So that this motion to delineate spaces and kind of spread them out into these large triumphant forms of architecture, neoclassical architecture, that comes in from Thomas Jefferson primarily, and I think one of the slides coming up will be his house. But many of the founding fathers kind of did want to borrow on the governing principles and the living principles of the Mediterranean, and that kind of starts the seed of the breakup between the federal government and the states, who are more still Anglo-Saxon in their thinking. I would say that you can see in the architecture the first inklings of problems we have today between worldviews at the federal level and at the state level in the architecture, even before the United States was formed. Even in the colonial era, you start seeing these differences show up in how people are living. So this is another like colonial architecture, I think in the 70s, I don't remember where, but even in here, you start seeing now the motion to create these protrusions of the space. So before the hallway becomes a main part of many American homes, you start seeing this pushing out that kind of is like it's creating a problem that the hallway will solve. Here, the home has begun protruding out to other areas, and there isn't yet a hallway. You just have to kind of like walk through living rooms and dining rooms and kitchens to get to the other side of the house, which is kind of awkward. Like there's no dedicated way to get from one side of the building to the other. So in terms of residential architecture, the buildings start following what the federal government is doing in its architecture, but with a less education of it. They start having these like problems that they run into, because you can imagine like obviously new money wants to look like old money, but it doesn't understand old money. So these kind of these changes in residential architecture start to borrow ideas from their federal overseers. They're like but they don't really know how to do it the right way. So if you go to the next slide, or if you have any questions on this, and this is Thomas Jefferson's house, and this is really like where essentially Thomas Jefferson studies the Palladian style in Italy, which is like a rebirth of the Italian villa style, basically, with a lot more added on. And here, what you see is essentially Thomas Jefferson has shattered the Anglo-Saxon living style into this like exaggeratedly stretched out experience. You see these massive hallways that are larger than the house. It's like the areas of habitation itself that are dedicated to different stables or work areas. And this also has to do with keeping, the servants away from the masters. But even in terms of like his house, you kind of start seeing this multipolar style where there are these poles in the house where the rooms are now orbiting around multiple poles rather than a central hearth. In his case, it was this library in the center here that had a dome on it, but there were also lesser domes on the sides. And so this moves from that polar design sense to more of a grid design sense that you get from the Mediterranean that starts spreading out. I don't know if you have any questions about this though.
Well, there's another interesting point as well, about the idea of the grid as applied to a city, right? Because the way that early planned American cities like DC is a great example were drawn up. It was very rational, right? It was, we will make a grid, it will be numbers going one way, letters going the other. And so the idea was, well, this will be a perfectly logical system for how to operate, how to move around a city. And you compare that to a more organic city, right, either in the US or in Europe, where it is very much something that sort of grew out. And, you don't necessarily have the kind of convenience of a planned grid, but you also have something that is more natural, I guess. Things kind of grew out by kind of like individual human decisions instead of the plan of a one master thinker. And I think that kind of like social technology of the grid as applies to architectures is kind of an interesting way to illustrate the kind of high watermark of rationalism, right? Do you see what I'm getting at there? Or is that just rambling?
No, you're completely right. Well, the ancient Romans tended to start all their cities on a grid, but one of the things that happened as the Roman Empire starts to decay, their grids start getting wobbly. They start getting these like broken up. Like new roads get cut in by lords, and new planned cities kind of can't maintain the same like idealistic order of their high period. The grid kind of the decay of the grid in the Mediterranean kind of models the decay of the empire, which is rather fascinating. But one of the things that happens when the Goths start invading is they start to look at this like idealized grid as like a ridiculous notion. Like this is just ridiculous. In their minds, this is like attempting to put man on like an equal like a forced equality kind of system. And the Germans are like the Goths. They're not Germans yet. The Goths and they're often they're like Slavic and um, other groups that were coming in with them. They kind of look at this grid as just a ridiculous notion, and one of the first things they do often when they conquered and set up a government is just cut a massive main road into the grid, like completely shattering it and putting their palace at the end of the main road and being like, now there's order. This is actual order. So to the Roman mind, the grid is order. It's like it's a way to idealize man's existence. But to the Northern European mind, order is imposing hierarchy onto that equal grid, which is like again, this comes into the sense of like the Romans want to find their great men. So if they put everyone on a level playing field, the great men will rise above the rest. Whereas the Gothic mind is we want to base our hierarchies on responsibilities. So make a big thick road for the palace where the man with the most responsibilities is going to live, and then the common people who have less responsibilities have less roads and less infrastructure per their need. And that's a very interesting like difference in urban planning. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Well, there's another one, right? Which is that i- there's a difference in rule, right, between the sort of like longhouse turned castle, right, which yet again is kind of a similar evolution of the same idea. Where you have outlying villages in times of danger, everyone kind of runs into the walls, and then the sort of the palaces we see in the Baroque period, right, kind of the high watermark of European civilization pre-French Revolution, where those are both symbols of authority, but there is a decay of the martial utility, right? Like Jefferson's home is not particularly a defensible structure, right? It's not built to have walls, it's not built to have moats. Similarly, you could look at something like Versailles, which is basically a pleasure palace, right? It is big and imposing. It is obviously built to incredibly high standard, but it is not necessarily a fortress. And I think that in that you also see a different conception of authority. In the same way, right? Like obviously Jefferson had slaves. I'm not trying to make a punitive moral point on that, but there is a difference between slaves and serfs and yeomen. In the kind of societies that have each of these produce different results as far as kind of like how they build buildings. Do you see what I'm getting at there? Where it's like you wouldn't necessarily have this kind of like sprawling, servants or slaves quarters in the society without that feature, right?
Yeah. Like in many ways, the South's tendency to create these spread out like segregated areas was hoping that the distance would be the defense rather than a physical structure. And in some ways, that is also a Mediterranean way of thinking, where well, if we put the serfs or the servants far away enough from us, they just won't be bothered to rebel, and that often was wrong in the Mediterranean. Whereas in Northern Europe, the lords were well aware of the brutality and wildness of their populations. So they built great walls and castles oftentimes. Like Rome had castles, of course, but you might know like the walls that they built were to keep the Northern Europeans out, not to keep their serfs away. So like when Romans built walls, it was usually to keep the rambunctious Northern Europeans out, so that they could enjoy their pleasure palaces. It's a really important aspect to grasp, where like the the Northern Europe built walls to protect themselves from their own people, and the Mediterranean built walls to protect themselves from the Northern Europeans.
All right. So let me pull up the next slide.
Yeah, so heading into the late 1800s, we now see in the American residential home the solution to that stretching out problem that was happening. The hallway. You see here a clearly defined hallway from one side of the building to the other, and this starts to define differences between private and public spaces, and more a mixing in of that Mediterranean living style into the Anglo-Saxon original core. Now, if you look closely, sometimes you'll see that some of these homes that I'll show you, they're still part of the house that orbits a hearth, but that a hallway divides it from the more like gridded public meeting areas. So in some ways, the Anglo-Saxon home has grown this kind of Mediterranean tumor that is attached to it. It's not quite yet either. It's no longer purely Anglo-Saxon, but it hasn't become like a Mediterranean villa. It's kind of like this like Frankenstein building, which we call the American home. And you might notice this in terms of like American homes tend to be these weird kind of blob textures with cubes protruding everywhere. And this is really a symptom of trying to merge these styles by force of will. Um, I would argue that this starts the decline of the American family when you start allowing private rooms to exist where children can plot and like party in secret, or parents can hide their lovers when the other parent is away. This starts to create a fragile and broken family structure that feeds into the 20th century and leads into what we have today. I don't know. Do you know say anything about this house?
Do I notice anything about it? I mean, I obviously, we do have the development of smaller rooms. There are hallways. I think there's probably a secondary conversation to be had about the development of privacy, right?
Yeah.
That the idea that everyone kind of has their personal space. And look, that's an interesting discussion. I look at a place like India, and I'm very comfortable with my Western conception of personal space. But within that, we see kind of a literal atomization within the house, right? That everything has got its own specific box away from the others. And obviously that is both a literal and kind of like a social atomization. So I think that's an interesting point. I don't know enough about architecture to point out exactly where a home like this is from, but that's kind of the first thing that comes to mind for me.
Yeah, this is these kind of homes first show up in New England. So this is kind of like the birth of the New England liberal, the atomized individual. it's not surprising at all that these atomized homes first show up in areas that are now the most atomized. So this is like a more of a upper class rich version of that. You'll note like the massive hallways that run through the entire sorry, the entire house. If you, it's hard to see the plan on this drawing. This is a Craigsdale. Oh, sorry, Craigside. I always mispronounce it. Craigside was a foundational Connecticut, I think, home, based on some of these architectural changes that were happening in Great Britain, as like the Norman culture starts to try to differentiate itself from the Anglo-Saxon culture. And again, this is like 800 years after the invasion, but they're still trying to find ways to differentiate their upper class nature from the common people. The upper class will always try to remodel itself to be different from the lower class, and this will oftentimes cause the adoption of strange and unusual ideas that are untested, and that's why a lot of times it fails. But in Connecticut and the rest of New England, this is known as basically the stick style or the shingle style, and these homes essentially are starting to find ways of doing Mediterranean style living, like these piles that, well, not even Mediterranean at this point, it would just be European like continental architecture. These homes are essentially trying to find a way to make the continental style into a Anglo-Saxon tradition. And at the point, the home starts looking a lot more put together, a lot more formalized. That there are clearly defined programs and focuses. It still has that kind of like boxy, pulling out multiple nodes vibe, but materially, this home has a lot more consistency in terms of how it's put together. This house sadly does not survive. I think it burned down in the 20s or something. Though it has been replicated a number of times by private people with money who like liked this idea and wanted to replicate it where they were. And that's like really looking at the interior where you still find the hearth. It's deep underneath all of that innovation, but it's still there. This like large central heating source for the family. Um, that's still there, and that's, I think it's fascinating that it still exists as late as like the 1920s, where this is kind of like the last light of the Anglo-Saxon family life before atomization really kicks off in the 1930s and 40s and into the 60s. But essentially, this is like just a drawing. It might be a little small on the YouTube screen, but if you look up Craigside, you'll be able to see it in other on Google. But essentially, right before atomization takes hold and divorce rates start rising, and atomization really just gets worse, you see this last light of the Anglo-Saxon hearth hidden underneath this like Frankenstein building full of all these different spaces borrowed from the continent, the European continent. And so, go on.
No, I just wanted to add, and if you've got concluding thoughts, you can wrap that up. But to me, it reminds me of and I'm going to say contemporary because I think it's sort of out. But there was kind of a move to so-called like open concept houses for a while. Do you see that as a desire to sort of return to that tradition, or is that from something else?
It is in some way a desire to undo atomization. Essentially, what happens in the time span from the 1930s to the 1960s and 70s, the hearth is ultimately thrown out of the house, and the GI Bill era of housing after World War II just completely throws the hearth out, and instead now you have a television or a radio or or some area where instead of gathering as a circle around a heat source or table to eat, now you're facing in like a linear fashion, like a movie theater, to your authority on the screen. And this change in terms of how the family is oriented in their family time, from looking at each other to looking at a screen, fundamentally breaks the ability for the family to form. And whether the architecture came first or the behavior came first, it doesn't really matter. The consequence was a very fast process of atomization, which created what we now call the boomers. um, and so people that grew up after that in the 80s and 90s kind of saw that their parents are a little bit off compared to their grandparents and what they read in books, and maybe it might be worth investigating how those older generations lived and if they could return. And this is even in the 80s with like in many ways postmodernism first attempted to kind of curtail modernism's destruction of the family, although it did in all the wrong ways. But yeah, in contemporary architecture, there is this idea to try to reinvent areas where the family looks at each other, talks to each other, stuff like that, to kind of like limit those those rooms that create atomization. One of the architects I know, he made these parts of a home where around the stairs where kids would kind of like, he noticed that his kids like to hang out on the stairs, um and talk to each other, because in the apartment that he lived in, that they couldn't really find anywhere else to kind of like make friends basically. And so he started designing his homes to have like stairs that have wider girth and more deeper, almost like a seating, turning the stair into a seating area, like a vertical seating area, with putting in bookshelves and stuff into the stair hall, and turning the stair hall into something like a new public space where children can make friends and talk to people and stuff like that. Um, and what he found was that like these homes where things like that occur, the families usually are a lot healthier. Um, you might also look at, for example, the home that Steve Jobs grew up in. Um, it did have a little bit more communal features compared to most homes, if I remember correctly, and that kind of like is thought to have I don't know, like he looked back on it in his childhood and like I forget the story, but he viewed that experience as something important. But yeah, there's a motion to find ways to reintroduce the idea of the hearth, where people gather and talk to the private American home. Of course, granted, people can't afford homes anymore, so a lot of times you end up trying to figure out how can we do this in a public way that people can have in a city or a town, because people aren't buying homes anymore, or can't afford homes anymore to even experience this. But yeah, that there's still a problem in the city of this like move to basically turn the apartment into just a bedroom, and then like you have to go out to have anything else, and like talk to other people. I don't really like that. Like it's basically living in a pod. There should be some kind of like control over these meeting spaces for communities to form. The problem with cities is that the modern American city doesn't want these communal areas to be for cliques, for like small groups. They want it to be for everybody, so that no dangerous thoughts happen.
Well, I think that that's an interesting point you bring up, which is the central place of the television, right? In a lot of modern, and I mean that deliberately, American homes. And you see it, and I realize that like home decorating is a completely separate discussion for another day. But there's something to be said about the hierarchy of a room, much in the same way of the hierarchy of a house, right? What do you put at the center of attention? And when quite literally the most prominent object is a TV, right? You're literally placing that on a pedestal. And I think that when we talk about different generations, right, the thing that really sets the baby boomers apart is that they were raised by television, right? They lived in the world created by the TV. And obviously, you see that if your parents or grandparents are kind of addicted to cable news, right? You see how those people are so kind of swept up by what the box says to them. And I think that it's interesting to kind of see that in a physical form, right? You can see the ideological impact of it, with certain people's inability to counteract the narrative control coming from the television. But I mean, like it is interesting to walk into someone's house and you can almost tell, right? You're like, oh, okay, I see. The TV is the central feature of the house. And yeah, it's an interesting point because in kind of legacy Southern homes, right, primarily antebellum, the first thing you see when you walk in is a grand, double spiral staircase, right? That was kind of the central feature of the home because, of course, you'd be entertaining, you'd sort of, make your grand entrance down the stairs. And that speaks to kind of the most valued thing, right? It was a kind of a social cachet in entertaining. And so I think that that's an interesting point, right? Which is what is the central feature of the house, kind of showing the values of the people that live inside of it.
Yeah, yeah, and in many ways, the personal computer was a subversion of the boomer box. I like calling televisions boomer boxes, but in many ways, the motion to like give your kid a personal computer in the '90s set off a self-destruction mechanism for the TV culture, because now the child could pick what he wanted rather than be broadcast what like the media wanted, right? He could filter on the screen what he was seeing. And in many ways, the centerpiece of children's rooms today is a computer, which basically how you differentiate yourself. The parent is watching something on the television, you're watching something else in your private computer. It's still atomization, of course. There's no sharing of culture between the household. Uh, but now the child can kind of like make their own interest on that screen with greater control than what the boomer or older generation has on the television. And that really started the process of what we now see with the Zoomer and Alpha, this like radical break from even atomization into this kind of like weird kind of like I don't know, like Zoomer culture is just bizarre to me. Even generation Gen Alpha is like these like obsessions with these like like skippity toilet and stuff like that. These kind of bizarre things, but it really stems from the ultra atomization of having a personal screen for yourself. But anyway, changing the centerpiece from either like a fireplace or staircase or even like a kitchen table to a screen radically changes how you interact with people and how you formulate your identity growing up. And we see that in terms of how the American house changed from a hearth based house to a like a TV screen based house to today to now something where like every room has its own centerpiece, and oftentimes a house doesn't even have something you enter into. It's just kind of like a dividing line between your personal room. Um, that's basically the house I live in. You walk into like a wall, and then you take a door from that wall, and then you see a centerpiece for the individual room. My house is like a old 1960s boomer box house, so it's just the way the atomization happened. But anyway, to finalize, I hope this like for the viewer, it makes you more aware of how the house forms the culture and the culture forms the house, and how you choose to orient your family in its inhabitation will inform how the family forms, and if it's a healthy family or a broken family or an atomization or an atomized family. Like you probably as a if you're listening to this, you probably don't want an atomized family. You probably want something that's more focused on the family looking at each other rather than looking at screens. So it's something very important to bear in mind, whether you're just starting a family or trying to fix a broken family from years ago.
Well, this was different than I was expecting, and quite fascinating. I feel like I learned a lot. But if people want to find more of your work, Luthemplaer, what's a good way for them to do that?
I still have a Substack. I haven't written it for a while. I'm going to try to actually write something about the differences between Northern European and Mediterranean culture. That's just like Luthemplaer, my name, .substack.com. I have a Twitter, but it's not really useful.
Well, I'll be sure to link that in the description. Again, man, thank you for coming on. This was a great conversation. I enjoyed it.
Yeah, thanks.
As far as my stuff, you can find the Jay Burden Show on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, anywhere you listen to podcasts. I also have a Substack that is occasionally updated, but the best way to support us is to head over to Axios Remote Fitness and Coaching. Like I said, I use the services there quite literally 4 days a week. I am a committed user. Highly recommend it to anyone interested in becoming less fat. And remember, everyone, keep your head up. The light can't last forever. Good night.